In April 1917, America entered World War I on the side of the British and the French. Toledo in 1917 was a city of Eastern European immigrants. Huge numbers of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe had made the city a different and better place by the time we get to 1917. But as World War I broke out, Toledo's immigrants often found themselves torn between their homes in the old world and their home in the new, and sometimes found themselves on the opposite sides of different arguments. But here on the east side, in our historic Hungarian neighbor Birmingham, some immigrants didn't want to join the American army in World War I for fear of fighting against their own relatives. One Birmingham woman named Priscilla Taylor remembered to a historian in the 1990s, "My father says no, he don't think he better join the American army because he's got a father and a couple of brothers and cousins that were still living there in Hungary. And he didn't want to fight, against them because, they could have." But it wasn't same just across the river. But over here on LaGrange Street, in the historic Polish neighborhood of Lagrinka, Polish Americans were ready to fight. They saw the war as a chance for their homeland to regain its independence from Germany and Russia. A Polish band that practiced just blocks away from St. Hedwig's here lost 56 of its musicians who volunteered for the U.S. Army en masse to fight for their old country and their new one. When America does enter the war, it's not because of something dramatic, like the Lusitania sinking in which many Americans were killed. It's because of something that, in retrospect, kind of seems pathetic. It's sort of like the Delomé letter in the Spanish-American War. It's an insult against the president. In 1917, the German foreign minister sends a telegram to Mexico. His name is Zimmerman. He sends a telegram, therefore Zimmerman telegram. And Zimmerman promises that Germany will help Mexico retake conquered territory in the United States if Mexico enters on the side of Germany in the First World War. Now, why is this a big idea? Why is it a big deal? Well, think about all the places in the United States that used to be part of Mexico prior to the Mexican War in the 1850s. This would be parts of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Utah, Colorado. These are major parts of the United States by the 19-teens in the First World War era that Germany is promising to get back. Now, obviously, let's just take a second and think about this rationally. Is Germany going to actually do this? Absolutely not. But the fact that they're saying to Mexico, we'll help you get these, is an attack or a perceived attack on the United States homeland worth getting involved in a war? Probably. And this is going to convince a lot of Americans that this is in fact the right thing to do. Prior to the Zimmerman telegram, German Americans, of whom there were many, especially in the Toledo area, many German Americans in the Toledo area, Irish Americans, of whom there were many in the Toledo area, were very opposed to entering the war on the side of Britain. German Americans had sympathies with their homeland. Irish Americans were very upset with Britain because during the First World War, and immediately before it, Britain is trying to put down rebellions in Ireland, and they're not feeling real happy and warm and fuzzy towards the British government. So the Zimmerman telegram in many ways is the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back. It convinces the American public that American support of Britain and France is the right thing to do. So in April of 1917, the United States enters the war to make America safe for democracy, make the world safe for democracy. The idea that America is the defender of this gift of liberty, which kind of harkens back to that whole city on the hill idea that we get going all the way back to the 1600s. So once you've got the declaration of war, you have to actually build an army. So soon after the American Declaration of War in April of 1917, America institutes a draft under what is called the Selective Service Act. And to this day, we still call the draft selective service. So all of us, when we turn 18, have to fill out a card with the Selective Service Administration, giving our name, our address, date of birth, etc. We submit it at the post office. Actually, I'm probably sure that you do this online now instead of the post office like we did in 1592 when I was 18 years old. You fill out a card with the Selective Service as we began in the First World War, and we have the ability to have a draft. So in 1917, they do have a draft, and they draft men from all over the United States to build out an Army, a Navy, and a Marine Corps. Notice what's not included there: a Coast Guard and an Air Force. The Air Force is part of the Army in the First World War and the Second World War. And the Coast Guard is just on the cusp of existence at this point because it has been assembled from several different services. So by June of 1917, only 15,000 Americans are in the war. 2 months after the United States enters the war, not that many Americans are part of the war. Now you say, not that many, what does that mean? Well, there were less Americans serving in the war in June of 1917 than there are students in Toledo public schools. 15,000 may sound like a big number, but it really isn't that big of a number. It takes a long time for the United States to train up the soldiers from the draft that it's going to need to send overseas. So throughout the year from June of 1917 to June of 1918, the United States is in this period of preparation, getting soldiers ready to fight in the war. And in fact, not until 1918, May of 1918, are there even 500,000 Americans on the front lines of this fight. It takes a long time. So, American battle experience. What battles did the Americans fight in? Well, this is where you get a little provincial. In the United States military, there are always really good-natured arguments between the services. The Marines, the Army, the Navy, they all call the Air Force today the Chair Force. The Marines like to make fun of the Army as being the guys who are the second ones there. Everybody, to my great dismay, everybody makes fun of the Coast Guard, but if you ever run into me on the street, I will be happy to explain to you how the Coast Guard are the real heroes of every war. So all of these inter-service rivalries aside, if we look at the early days of American involvement in World War I, who saved the day, there is absolutely no doubt it's the United States Marine Corps. The United States Marines had maintained a force throughout the years, and they had also done an exceptional job of training soldiers before the First World War and into the draft of the First World War. American Marines especially bolster the French forces at two major battles in the spring and summer of 1918, Château-Thierry and Belleau Wood, Bois de Belleau. Marines absolutely made a reputation in these two fights. Prior to World War I, Marines were seen as basically the soldiers that were held on ships. So Marines were the guys on a ship where if two ships fought against each other, the Marines would be the guys crossing over to the enemy ship and attempting to capture or kill all of the men on the enemy ship in order to take the enemy ship. Marines were seen as basically, if this makes any sense at all, the Army of the Navy. But in the First World War, the United States Marine Corps earns its own reputation as an elite fighting force. The Marines at Château-Thierry and Bois de Belleau are absolutely a decisive element in the end of the fight, being positive for the Allies. And to this day, many young Marines who have learned the lessons of Château-Thierry and Belleau Wood will sometimes sneak in to the Belleau Wood Memorial in France. Now we're talking 102 years later. They will sneak in and camp there overnight to try and kind of feel the experience of the Marines who were there several generations before them. The bulk of the American force, the Army forces, come in the fall of 1918. They are part of two major offensives that fall that are absolutely decisive offensives. I hope that nothing I have said so far offends those of you who are from Army families, because the Army comes in, the United States Army comes in at Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and the United States Army, without a doubt, is the decisive force at the end of 1918 in these two major battles. Now, those two major battles are going to bring about the end of the war, and that's also where the bulk of American casualties are going to lie. So let's talk a little bit about how we've memorialized those American casualties. This small plaque above one of the west entrances to Waite High School's Molotov Stadium is dedicated to George Fisher and Walter Gourley, both of whom graduated from Waite and both of whom joined the United States Navy in the First World War. Both of them died within weeks of each other in January 1919 as the military was demobilizing and coming home. They were two of the last American casualties of the First World War. When all is said and done, when we look at the cost of war for the Americans, this is a big number. 116,516 Americans are dead in the First World War. That is a big number. That's about the size of the population of like South Bend, Indiana. That's about 1/3 of the city of Toledo. That's a big number. That's a lot of people to die basically in 1 year of one war. Now, all of you who are watching this, you lived through the COVID-19 crisis, and if you paid any attention to the number of Americans who died during COVID-19, it's a much larger number than 116,000. But at this time in America, that was a big number. 53,000 of the 116,000 dead died in combat, and this was America's largest death toll since the Civil War. As you guys know from watching earlier videos with me, the Spanish-American War resulted in about 3,000 American deaths, which, again, 3,000 is nothing to make fun of. That's a lot of Americans who died in the service of their country. But compared to the 53,000 in the First World War, this is a lot of people. Now, our losses as Americans in the First World War, we look back on as grievous losses. We look on these as the number of people it took to make a difference in the outcome of the war. However, if you look at the death toll for our enemies and for our allies, those death tolls are much larger. And especially when we look at the death toll for our allies, more than 1 million British men died in the service of democracy in this war. More than 1 million French, more than 1 million Italians. America's death toll in comparison to our allies in the First World War, our death toll is minuscule. And the First World War is not really alive in the American mentality today. We don't look back on the First World War as a turning point in American history typically. But our friends in Britain and our friends in France, they absolutely look at the First World War as a tipping point in their history. We didn't suffer to nearly the degree our allies or our enemies did, but it was still a terrible cost for everyone, and a cost that was going to shape the way we would approach future wars. Now, behind the scenes, and this is probably the most important part, behind the scenes, of those 116,000 American deaths, yes, 53,000 were from combat. 63,000 were from disease. Specifically, they were from a global pandemic that hit in the middle of the end of the war. And that pandemic is something we're going to talk about in depth in our next discussion together. American preparedness had changed our nation. Now, did it change the end of the war? Yes, you can argue American intervention in the war absolutely changed the course of that war. But the more important thing for the purpose of our American history classes is how the First World War changed America. And that's what we're going to discuss in our next video together. Thank you guys for your attention. Take care. Goodbye.